Hi, welcome to Jeremy's Tech Channel, and today we're going to discuss what do you miss, what do you lose by only using open source software. Now that might be a little unfair to frame this discussion that way. What do I lose by using open source software? I understand that many of you who use and only use open source software specifically for philosophical reasons, you feel like you lose by using proprietary software. What I'm specifically talking about is apples and apples comparison to software. Someone posted a comment on one of my videos. They had some fair points. I didn't agree with all of them, but essentially the premise of the comment was, with the exception of one open source program that I'll mention in a little bit, everything else lags in comparison to the proprietary alternative. And that might be the first issue, is looking at things in open source as alternatives. Many of the ones who are industry leaders or competitors, you don't look at them as alternatives, right? What I realized is when you use software a specific way, you tend to look at open source and proprietary software or whatever application very differently, and what you're willing to give up really about what you actually need to use. And we have these main groupings of use cases for computers. Now, this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but I think these are the main ways people use their computers. To think of it this way is important because this is maybe going to help you decide whether or not you should use Linux or BSD or Windows or Mac or whatever it is. I specifically am coming from a multimedia production background. For the past 12 years, I've done that regularly. I have some needs in order to get things done efficiently and quickly. I have some needs because of the ecosystem of what is being used as far as industry standard. And when you use software for an extended period of time, feature set and workflow are very important to you. So I want to start specifically. I have 5 main ways that we use devices with operating systems on there as far as a daily use case scenario. And I want to quickly talk about this because this person, like I said, they made a fair point. And they felt like Blender was the only open source software that was perfection. Essentially, I read that to mean that it was the industry standard, right? That everyone who does 3D development and design, and there really aren't that many open source projects that are considered the industry standard. Now, that doesn't mean that makes them not good or a secondhand citizen or not fully featured. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But if that is your workflow, that is your space, that is what you do daily, that is how you spend hours a day in your computer, those kinds of things do matter. If that's how you make money, if that's how you make a living, you want the best. Not only do you want the best, you want it to make your life quick and easy. You don't need to be spending time tweaking this, that, and the other, or having to go in the back end and make something happen. You need it to work well and easy. I'm in a 60-day challenge, and this could be a sticking point for me. I went through and did an inventory of what I need and what I need daily. And with the exception of audio over IP, that just means that if you're recording or doing live sound at a venue, you can route the audio, each channel of audio, instead of through old analog XLR lines, you can route it through a Cat6 cable to another device like a mixing console or a recording device over IP. Each device has an IP, each line has an IP, and it takes in information, and you're able to record, you're able to mix, you're able to add a lot of functionality. Now, that right there, as far as who I deal with daily in life, means that I can't use Linux for my daily work right now. Now, personally at home, I don't need Dante. It's not a big deal. So Ardour is working great for me as far as audio routing. The other piece to that is once we get that audio, we have post-production needs. So I pull up Logic Pro, I get going, and I have my plugins that saves me all kinds of times. I use Wave plugins, I use Isotope, I use these different plugins to help me scrub audio that helps me get them set and good sounding and pleasing and quickly. So it really wasn't about Logic Pro for me per se. It really was about those plugins, right? So I've been exploring open source plugins. Some of them are up to par, some of them are not. And they may have the functionality, but they don't sound as good. Or maybe they sound really good, but they don't have the functionality. And I think that's what this commenter was talking about. There's always seems to be something that's lacking, right? And when you're dealing with something that is community written and driven and updated and feature set growth, those things are done because of certain needs of the users. And I wonder how many professional power users are using Ardour. I know there are some. Before you go, well, so-and-so uses Ardour. I know that, and it's not Ardour's fault. But my point is that we have to understand what is available for us and what you actually need. And here's what I mean by that. Like, I knew going in and doing some test work with Kdenlive that it's close for me to use as an alternative to Final Cut Pro, but it's not as feature set, and it doesn't allow for me to get some things done as quickly. Now, I'm not talking about comfortability with program, where I have my shortcut keys programmed and I have a sense of where things are and it saves me time. That's not what I'm talking about per se, although that is a part of it. There were some things that were missing. I decided to go with DaVinci Resolve. I had a couple other editors in my office that used DaVinci Resolve, moved over, and there was a Linux version. Now, DaVinci Resolve is not open source, it's proprietary. So I don't know if that necessarily works within this discussion, but I do think it should be noted that I felt like I needed to choose a proprietary video editor to make things happen quickly, easy, and efficiently for myself. There also were a couple other options. There is Lightworks, which is the other major proprietary video editing software that I looked at. You see the movies down there that were used with Lightworks, Pulp Fiction, Braveheart, The Irishman, Jerry Maguire. You get the deal. They're like, hey, people use this software. And I researched it and it wasn't for me. I essentially had to realize that OpenShot, Shotcut, Kdenlive, although work very well. And for most editing needs, you're able to work in a good place. Now, Kdenlive has worked really hard to help with color grading and that kind of space, and that you can tell us where they're focusing, getting some of that working at a professional level. And if I recorded something on my camera and I pulled it in and I needed to do some edits to edit that video and get it down into a format to send to YouTube, I could do that on Kdenlive or OpenShot or Shotcut. But to the commenter's point, Blender also has a video editor, and it's pretty good. It really depends on where you are most proficient. Whether or not I can get this detailed Excel spreadsheet to work on LibreOffice. It doesn't matter as much to me. I've been able to work very well with DaVinci Resolve, GIMP, Inkscape, and some of the open source plugins and what comes with DaVinci Resolve. The thing is with DaVinci Resolve as well, DaVinci Resolve has more than just the nonlinear video editing. It has compositing, and it has Fairlight, which is an audio console with essentially all the plugins that I would typically use, at least the functionality of them, all in one place. I really do love that. The one thing of note I will say, I believe OBS is a competitor to whatever proprietary software is out there. No, it's not perfect, but it works really well. I record every video through OBS. You can do more than just live streaming with OBS, and it works really well. I pulled up this comparison between GIMP and Photoshop. Most people think, I need Photoshop. I need my Photoshop. If you're a professional who does more than just photography, you do creative design, you do need Photoshop in comparison. If you deal mostly with photography, right? GIMP can meet more than your needs and is completely feature rich. But what happens is if someone gets a PSD file, that's the file for Photoshop, and they need to open it up. They need to manipulate it. And so immediately you go, well, obviously I need Photoshop. You go through these descriptions as far as what the differences are. And besides some specific things for creative use versus photography use, as far as pay structure, as far as what can be opened and what can't be opened in each software, besides one being open source and one being proprietary, the main difference is right here, you see Photoshop is ideal for photographers and designers and photo editors. And GIMP is easy to use for non-professionals, is what they say here. By the way, GIMP can open and edit PSD files, but I show that because what do you really need and want? A lot of times we say we want the best, and then that's what we get because we know it's the best. But what do you need is really more of the question to be answered. For me, Kdenlive wasn't going to cut it. OpenShot wasn't going to cut it. Now, are they great programs? Yeah. Could I edit things quickly? And even this video, the way this video is being shot today, could I edit it in Shotcut, OpenShot, Kdenlive? Yes. The way this video is done today, the one I'm recording right now, could be edited in those and done well. But when I start getting into more challenging color grading, if I want to start doing some compositing, like what you can do with Adobe After Effects, then the value of DaVinci Resolve gets stronger. I am starting to really buy into the open source movement as far as what its ideals and goals and the philosophies are. But I'm also a realist and know what I need. Number two, another group of people is Office Enterprise situations. Microsoft Office is the standard and has continued to be the standard. No one developed a better spreadsheet application than Microsoft. Everyone's just trying to copy it. And that really lends itself to what this commenter said. Blender is the industry standard. What other open source software is the industry standard? There are some competitors, but would you say that they're the industry standard? You can use LibreOffice very well. It has almost the exact same functionality. And in fact, if you don't need to have shared between groups of people or collab between groups of people for certain documents, LibreOffice is going to work for you. It really is. It's got all of those functionality pieces ready for you. What you might lag behind in is in presentation software, which PowerPoint is. PowerPoint gets used for presentations across almost every office in the United States. You know, there are some other options now, and some of them are web-based, like Prezi, which, by the way, is better, and you could use on Linux if you use a web-based application. And yes, there are web-based options for Microsoft Office. PowerPoint is that standard. Now, I will say that is getting moved away from. People are using Prezi. People are also using an application called ProPresenter for presentations, specifically at conferences and larger venues. We deal with that on a weekly basis. We support multiple things. I work at a church. Guess what? That gets used on Sunday morning. We also have conferences come in. Guess what we use? We use ProPresenter. And when they come in with their PowerPoint, we convert it to be able to be used on ProPresenter because it's great. The quality is great. So we do that. And if they need to control it from the stage, we give them a tablet. We let them install the application on their phone. That also works for Keynote as well. I'm sure there's a PowerPoint remote as well. Things are moving beyond that standard as far as from a Microsoft Office suite perspective. But guess what? ProPresenter isn't developed for Linux. It was originally developed for Mac and then ported to Windows and now developed for Windows as well. I mean, nothing for Linux. And that's okay, but you should be aware that if these are things that you need daily, maybe open source isn't for you, at least in this area. Now, if you have a Flamingo fan club and you need to do a quick presentation, guess what? LibreOffice is going to work great for you. No, there isn't an industry standard open source for that, but 98% of what you're going to need is going to be there. Complex spreadsheets, great word processing. You really just need fonts, right? You need those fonts. You need to be able to open up a Word document or whatever. You can do that. Now, there are some other alternatives to LibreOffice that are specifically trying to help with compatibility with Microsoft formats like OnlyOffice or OpenOffice. Those kinds of things are also available and work great. That's the thing. No, LibreOffice and OnlyOffice aren't the industry standard, but they work amazingly well. I don't feel like I'm missing out because of how I use word processing spreadsheets. It doesn't matter as much to me like it might for you. So you need to be aware of that. The next group of people, so we started out with people who tend to use computers for audio, visual, photography, that kind of multimedia production. Then you have the office and the enterprise use of why you would use a computer. Mostly is for email, word processing, spreadsheets, presentations, those kinds of things. Understand, right? The next group is for people that specifically program, code, and development. I believe that is an extremely easy translation between what you currently use and for programmers. Now, I'm not a programmer, so a programmer could comment and tell me, it's not exactly true. I prefer to program on Windows or a Mac for one reason or another, and I will completely understand that I don't have a full understanding of that. But for me as a user and me opening up a text editor or opening up Vim or working within the terminal with Vim or Nano, getting a sense of what that is, I'm learning, guys, on that, seems to be pretty full-featured to me. So for me, that's going to work. And I think for a lot of you, Kdenlive is going to work great. And I think for a lot of you, LibreOffice is going to work great, right? Okay, so the next group is gamers. Gamers. And gamers have driven the hardware market for a long time now. A lot of hardware is developed for gamers because guess what? They're going to spend the money on those graphics cards and those multi-threaded, multi-core processors and that DDR5 memory. They're going to spend the money on that. Other people who will spend money on that are people who want to render things quickly, like myself. But gamers really have driven that whole, just cases and RGB on everything. It has been driven by the gaming market. And so they have a powerful say and share on how things tend to work. And what they typically look for, can I play the game that I want to play right now? I want to play the new AAA title. I need to get ready for esports and I want to try to do that. Well, does said operating system, Mac is included in this. There's a lot that Mac doesn't have as far as gaming goes. And so they typically don't have Macs. Now, are there games on Mac? Yeah. Are there games on Linux? Yeah. Are there AAA titles on Linux? Yeah. I play Apex Legends. Still considered a AAA title. It's outstanding, and it works flawlessly on Linux. Valve is working really hard with Steam and the Steam OS and the Steam Deck to try to bridge the gap and to make it more than just an alternative and make it a competitor with Windows PC gaming. I don't know how long that's going to take, but if I'm real about it right now at this very moment, because of how the market share works and why in the world wouldn't a AAA title work itself to make sure it works for Windows best first? They have to develop things for who their biggest users are, the biggest user base is, and that's understandable. Does that mean I can't game on Linux? Absolutely not. There's thousands of games, thousands of quality games, thousands of outstanding, visually appealing, challenging games on Linux. Now, most of those games are proprietary. How many of the open source games do you get that is as competitive as AAA titles? And that's where this commenter, I think, is kind of making his point. The next place is servers. Linux and BSD dominate just the way it is. It is the industry standard to use a Linux or another open source operating system for your server. It is the industry standard. Now, the last group is home use. There are people that just use a web browser. It really doesn't matter which operating system they use, if I'm being honest. Would I like for them to use an open source web browser? Yeah, of course I would. I would love for them to use an open source web browser and an open source operating system. They open up their Google Chrome web browser. They go to Gmail and open up Gmail. Then they open up Facebook, and then they open up whatever 3 or 4 other social media groups that they have. If they're not just on a phone doing all of this, right? Then they open up Google Docs or Office 365, whatever they call it. And then they check out their websites and they move on with their day. They close the web browser, they shut the computer or the laptop, and they move on. They really just don't care. Now, they may want to dabble in FreeCAD or AutoCAD. They may want to dabble in OBS or this cool game. But really, a web browser pretty much meets most of their needs. And we need to be real with that. Home users pretty much can use most anything that open source has provided for them and then feel like it's fully featured and available and nice. I would say there are many open source competitors. No matter how you feel about Firefox, Firefox is a direct competitor with Chrome, and it works extremely well. You have extensions, you have that, it works great. OBS is a direct competitor. In fact, I don't know if I'd call it industry standard, but it works really, really well. GIMP is not industry standard, but it works really, really well. Is it as full-featured as Adobe Photoshop? No, it is not. Are the open source plugins for audio work just as good as Isotope or Waves plugins? In some cases, yes. And in some cases, no. I guess my point is I don't think that this commenter was wrong. Actually, I think from a certain perspective, he had a valid point to say that, there is only one industry standard, and if you work in that area, that's going to be what you need. But in every other area of how you use a computer, it doesn't matter as much. It's nice to say that I have the industry standard for everything. It's nice to say that, but what do you actually use? I've been able to use GIMP and not use Photoshop to handle cutting out things in an image in a JPEG or change something and manipulate it, and it works great and exactly as advertised, and that's exactly how I would use Adobe Photoshop. I'm not designing something like someone who uses Photoshop does. So for me, it's more than enough. But I think you should think about this. What as a user are you actually trying to achieve? I think most of us have our special niche, whether it's office needs, video, audio production needs, server space needs, programming, coding. I don't miss Microsoft Office, but I'm not creating the most detailed spreadsheets when I use a spreadsheet. What did I conclude in this discussion? There are so many different users that use a computer and an operating system and an application. And I do think a lot of people are right. The applications you use are what drives what operating system you use. And if it doesn't matter, like it's on multiple platforms, then it matters less to you. I understand that. But I do believe we tend to just go, I want the best, and spend way too much money on the Adobe Suite because you actually don't use half the features that it has. You decide you want Microsoft Office, I gotta have it, but you don't even use half of the features it has. You wouldn't even use half the features of an open source version of an Office suite. You wouldn't even use half of what GIMP has to offer. I'm not using half of what GIMP has to offer. I am in video editing though. I'm real with what my needs are, and I was able to find a way to make that work within Linux. Now, that also means that I've not fully been able to move completely open source. And I think there's a lot of us that are in that camp. Either you're working on gaming, or there's other proprietary software, like I use Spotify. You may hate that I just said that. That's okay. I understand. I'll get there one day, but there's very few streaming services that work as well in its current iteration as Spotify. I thought this was fascinating to think through this. There is something to be said about open source is way better than where it was 15 years ago. There are applications that are competitors, and there is some industry standard open source applications. I hope you gathered what I was trying to say in my ramble. I want to discuss this. Let's kind of think through. Is there an industry standard open source software that I'm unaware of? Let me know in the comments. Let me know what is industry standard that's open source. Maybe you feel differently. Maybe you feel like the philosophy of open source gives you such a better place than getting the industry standard application. Thanks for joining me today. If you made it through this ramble, thank you. Thanks for listening. I hope it sparks some thoughts and interest for yourself as well as you process your day and what's going on in your life. I hope this content was valuable for you, and I'm going to try my best to give the best content I can. See you next time.